I remember the exact moment I realised American politics had entered its hold my beer phase. It was a warm Sunday evening, the kind where the studio lights feel slightly too hot. The audience has settled into that pleasant pre-show murmur, and I'm standing backstage wondering whether I should have eaten something other than a protein bar that tastes like compressed regret. The producers counted down. 5, 4, 3. And then I walked out to applause, waving like a man who had absolutely not spent the previous 10 minutes staring at a teleprompter and whispering, "Please let this make sense." The audience cheered, the cameras rolled, and I took my place behind the desk. "Welcome, welcome, welcome to Last Week Tonight," I began, smiling in the way television hosts are contractually obligated to smile even when the world is actively on fire. It had been another busy week. The Russian invasion of Ukraine had entered its third month, which was a sentence so grim and heavy it seemed almost unfair to place it next to anything else. Elon Musk continued to, as I put it, musk everything up, a phrase that somehow required no further explanation because everyone watching knew exactly what I meant, and Madison Cawthorn, Congress's freshest-faced idiot, had once again brought a loaded handgun to an airport. And at this point, airport security probably had a little laminated card with his photo on it labelled, "Check this guy first." But instead of diving into those stories, we decided to focus on something closer to home, the year's elections. Governors and local officials across the country were on the ballot, and many of them seemed determined to make headlines through increasingly elaborate political stunts. The first star of this particular circus was Ron DeSantis. I introduced him as a man who had what I could only describe as Green Book vibes, which, in retrospect, may have been the nicest thing I said about him all night. We'd talked before about his so-called Don't Say Gay bill and Disney's belated condemnation of it. Disney had eventually spoken out, which prompted DeSantis to retaliate in a way that felt less like governance and more like a villain in a direct-to-streaming superhero movie. News footage appeared on the screen behind me. Ron DeSantis was signing a law ending Disney's self-government and tax privileges. The self-government arrangement known as the Reedy Creek Improvement District. And yes, I initially mispronounced it on purpose because if politicians can make up ridiculous laws, I can make up ridiculous pronunciations, allow Disney World to function as a sort of self-contained municipal government. It provided fire services, EMS, electricity and other essential functions. Essentially, Disney World was a tiny kingdom where Mickey Mouse was one infrastructure project away from becoming an absolute monarch. "There is no morgue at Disney," I told the audience with mock seriousness. "Because no one has ever died at Disney, and no one will ever die at Disney. Do you hear me?" The audience laughed, though I suspect some of them laughed nervously, wondering whether I'd just cursed their next family vacation. The problem, however, was that experts pointed out DeSantis' grand gesture may not have been thought through. There were concerns that the law could violate the contract clause of the Florida Constitution. More practically, dissolving the district could leave Orange and Osceola counties responsible for over $1 billion in bond debt. $1 billion. That is the kind of number that makes local officials suddenly develop stress-induced hobbies like screaming into pillows. DeSantis responded to these concerns with the reassuring phrase, "Don't worry, we have everything thought out." Now, I don't know about you, but there are few words in the English language more alarming than "don't worry" coming from someone who is clearly causing the thing you should be worried about. He sounded like a frat boy explaining a noise complaint to the police. "Don't worry, officer. We've got everything under control. Would you like a beer?" Of course. Follow-up statements from his office were delightfully vague. A spokeswoman admitted they did not even have a written plan for how the dissolution would proceed, which is exactly what you want to hear from the people potentially reorganising $1 billion governmental structure. "We'll figure it out later." To be clear, I told the audience, I have no problem with Disney paying more taxes. In fact, I'd love it if giant corporations paid their fair share. But doing it through meaningful tax reform is very different from doing it because one politician is angry at a cartoon mouse for acknowledging the existence of gay people. And DeSantis was not alone. Next came Greg Abbott of Texas, who had apparently decided that governing should be treated like a reality show challenge called How Many People Can I Inconvenience Before Lunch? Abbott had announced that he would send charter buses of migrants to Washington, D.C., a move that was already controversial enough. But then he decided to subject every commercial truck crossing the Texas border to additional inspections. These trucks were already inspected by US Customs and the Department of Transportation. Abbott's Department of Public Safety inspections were supposedly aimed at stopping human smuggling. In practice, they caused absolute chaos. A news clip showed a truck driver who had spent 12 hours waiting to cross the border. 12 hours. I told the audience there was no greater hell than being pointlessly stuck in traffic for 12 hours because of Greg Abbott. Then I corrected myself. Actually, there was one greater hell: being stuck in traffic for 12 hours with Greg Abbott. That is a road trip movie no one wants to see. Imagine the endless small talk. Imagine him asking if you've heard about his latest policy initiative while you stare out the window contemplating whether you could survive in the desert with nothing but a granola bar and spite. The inspections lasted only 8 days before Abbott called them off. During that time, Texas reportedly lost an estimated $4 billion due to disruptions. And what did the inspections uncover? No migrants, no drugs, no weapons, no contraband. They did, however, find oil leaks and flat tyres, so Abbott had essentially created a massive border traffic jam only to perform the duties of the world's most expensive Jiffy Lube. If you're going to spend billions of dollars and ruin thousands of people's day, you'd at least hope for something more dramatic than, "Sir, your tyre pressure is low." But the evening's parade of political absurdity was only beginning. I introduced the next figure, Alex Villanueva, though in my haste and amusement, I mangled his name several times and described him as looking like a potato cowboy. Villanueva's re-election campaign had been overshadowed by allegations that he directed a cover-up of an incident in which one of his deputies knelt on a detainee's head for 3 minutes. It was a serious accusation involving abuse of power and lack of transparency. Villanueva's response was not, notably, to focus on the alleged abuse. Instead, he launched a criminal investigation into who had released the video to the Los Angeles Times. The sheriff publicly pointed to his political opponent, the Inspector General, and an LA Times reporter as people he wanted to know more about. He called the leaked footage stolen property and suggested there had been criminal intent. I stared at the camera in disbelief. When you're accused of being complicit in a terrible act, I said, being more concerned about who exposed it than the accusation itself does not exactly convey innocence. I then offered a hypothetical. If someone said, John Oliver likes to be called Big Daddy Zazu with a long, long beak around the office, and my immediate response was, who said that? Was it Joseph? I'm going to investigate Joseph. That would be more than a little suspicious, wouldn't it? The audience laughed. And for the record, I added, Big Daddy Zazu runs a tight ship. Legally, I had to note that Villanueva denied wrongdoing and claimed he only learned of the kneeling incident 8 months after it occurred, at which point he immediately launched an investigation. However, a former top official in his department had filed a claim stating she watched the video with him just 5 days after the incident, so either someone was mistaken or time itself had become a suspect. Villanueva had originally campaigned as a reformer in a department notorious for corruption, yet his record since taking office had been, shall we say, less than inspiring. A 2019 Inspector General report found that officials under him cancelled 45 administrative investigations into employees over a 2-month period. Some of those cases involved domestic violence, child abuse, and sexual misconduct with an inmate. And as if that weren't enough, Villanueva appeared determined to make his re-election campaign a full-blown culture war spectacle. In one clip, he declared that 2022 would be a referendum on a national disease and that wokeism was on the ropes. I paused. You probably thought the national disease he was referring to was the literal one that has killed nearly 1 million Americans, I told the audience. Or perhaps the figurative one that is BTS fever. And by the way, Yongi, marry me. I have the documents. Instead, Villanueva was talking about wokeism, which, as near as I could tell, meant people politely asking him not to make fun of their sociology major nephew, but nothing prepared me for his campaign advertisement. I warned the audience that I was about to show all 30 seconds of it because there was not a single part they did not need to see. The ad began with ominous music and a woman declaring that she feared for her home's future because the California dream has turned into a nightmare. Then came shots of rollerbladers, smiling people, and what appeared to be an inexplicably cheerful depiction of a break-in. I had never seen anyone so happy while getting robbed, and I once saw Glenn Close at the Oscars. The soundtrack was Ave Maria, which struck me as an odd choice for a campaign supposedly trying to evoke the California dream. Not California Dreamin', not Hotel California Ave Maria. It was as though the campaign had asked itself, what song best captures Southern California? And someone had confidently replied, a funeral hymn. The ad concluded with an inexplicably wet Villanueva looking like a high school coach moments before being arrested for spying on the girls' locker room, declaring, let's stand up to the corruption, let's fight for ourselves, which was an astonishing slogan, considering he had been the one running the sheriff's department for the previous 4 years. It was essentially an advertisement for voting against himself. I told the audience that the most depressing part was that Villanueva might actually be re-elected. Bullying reporters could help him, just as DeSantis's and Abbott's harmful stunts could help them. Because modern politics often seemed less about helping the most people and more about hurting the people your supporters dislike, even if all voters got in return was a logistical nightmare, a 12-hour traffic jam, and the least watchable depiction of Southern California since La La Land. And with that, I took a breath, glanced at my notes and prepared to move on to the next segment. Because somehow, despite everything we had just covered, the evening was still warming up. By this point in the evening, I had already spent a considerable amount of time discussing governors, sheriffs, billion-dollar debt, and a campaign advertisement that looked like it had been directed by a haunted rollerblader. Naturally, the only logical next step was to turn our attention to a 7-foot-tall basketball legend explaining gasoline economics in a way that made me briefly question whether numbers were real. The segment began with footage of Shaquille O'Neal discussing the rising cost of gas. Shaq, a man whose career achievements include 4 NBA championships, an MVP award, and somehow fitting into a normal-sized television studio chair, was lamenting that it cost him $80 to fill up his vehicle. Now, I sympathise with that. Gas prices are painful. Watching the numbers climb at the pump feels like being slowly charged admission to your own commute. But Shaq had a solution. A truly magnificent solution. He explained that instead of waiting until his tank was empty and paying $80 all at once, he would simply refill it when it reached half a tank by adding $20. Then when it gets back to half, he said, you put another 20. The hosts around him stared with the exact expression you'd expect from people who had just witnessed someone confidently divide by zero. One of them gently pointed out that half of $80 is $40. Shaq refused to yield. No, listen to what I'm saying, he insisted. And this exchange continued for what felt like an entire geological era. The others tried to explain that adding $20 at half a tank would not magically refill the tank to full. Shaq responded as though they were the unreasonable ones. At one point he declared, case closed. Shut the hell up. All of you, which is the kind of confidence I aspire to have in literally any area of my life. Imagine being so certain of yourself that you can dismiss basic arithmetic with the authority of a Supreme Court ruling. I watched the clip with the audience and shook my head. Case closed indeed, I said. Trust me, my gas method works. The crowd laughed, though I suspect some of them were secretly trying to calculate whether Shaq's method could somehow be applied to their mortgages. And then, after that delightful detour into mathematical fantasy, we arrived at the evening's main story, pollution. Yes, pollution! Because nothing says Sunday night entertainment quite like environmental catastrophe. I introduced the topic by playing an old public service announcement from the 1960s. A stern narrator warned viewers about the dangers of air pollution while a man held his breath dramatically, as though he were auditioning for the world's least convincing mime troupe. Before you take another breath, the PSA intoned, think what air pollution may be doing to your lungs. The man obediently held his breath. Then the narrator added, almost as an afterthought, By the way, holding your breath is not the answer. I stared at the screen in admiration. Flawless! I told the audience, not a single flaw. The only criticism I had was that the PSSA could have had more fun with the words written on the balls the man was holding in his mouth. If you're already making a bizarre 1960s anti-pollution commercial, why not go all in? Bet you didn't know these were in my mouth, perhaps. Or, these are Kermit's eyes. The world was their oyster, and they chose restraint. But the truth was that pollution is not merely an abstract environmental issue. It affects all of us, though not equally. Some communities bear a far heavier burden than others, and that burden is often determined by race. Studies have found that black Americans are exposed to 38% more polluted air and are 75% more likely to live in communities bordering a plant or factory. Crucially, this disparity persists even when controlling for income. One study found that black Americans earning $200,000 a year were exposed to more air pollution than white Americans earning $25,000. I paused to let that sink in. Proving, I said, that yet again, racism is one of the few things in this country more powerful than money. I then presented what I described as America's current top 5 power rankings. Racism, beef, viral videos of soldiers reuniting with their dogs, Jay Khaled's PR team, and then money. The audience laughed, but the underlying reality was grim. Environmental racism is not an accident. It is the result of decades of policy decisions, zoning laws, and governmental neglect. To illustrate this, we travelled back to 2008 when a massive coal ash spill occurred in Tennessee. Tons of toxic waste were dumped into a largely white community. The good news was that 4 million tons of coal ash were removed. The bad news was where they were taken. Uniontown, Alabama, a predominantly black community 300 miles away. A resident of Uniontown put it plainly, if the white folks didn't want it, why do you think it's good enough for the blacks? She was absolutely right. It seems, I told the audience, when white people don't want something anymore, they either dump it on minority communities or sew a hummingbird on it and list it on Etsy as handmade vintage. The fact is that black neighbourhoods can be targeted with astonishing precision, and the consequences are severe. Pollution contributes to heart disease, asthma, and premature death. Black Americans are nearly 3 times as likely to die from exposure to pollution. Even within the same city, life expectancy can vary dramatically depending on the zip code. An environmental expert explained that 2 adjacent zip codes could have a life expectancy disparity of 10 to 15 years based on what is present in those neighbourhoods. I found this particularly depressing. You can live 15 fewer years depending on your zip code, I said. That is the worst zip code news since they added those 4 digits at the end. I then confessed that I refused to learn those extra 4 digits. I know my 5-digit zip code, my social security number, my birthday, one of my children's birthdays, and that is the end of my numbers. I am not learning anymore. The historical roots of environmental racism are impossible to ignore. For decades, the federal government engaged in redlining, a policy that segregated housing based on race. Black families were denied government-backed home loans in white neighbourhoods and were often confined to areas zoned for industrial use. In Dallas, maps from the 1930s and 1940s show that redlined black and brown neighbourhoods overlap almost perfectly with modern industrial zones. It was not coincidence. This helps explain why life expectancy in Joppa, a predominantly black area of Dallas with heavy industrial zoning, is only 71 years, while in the predominantly white Highland Park, it is 84. 13 years. 13 years determined, in part, by where you are allowed to live. And sometimes the environmental injustice is impossible to miss. Take Shingle Mountain, a literal mountain of roofing shingles dumped by a company called Blue Star Recycling in a largely black and Latino neighbourhood in Dallas. 100,000 tons of shingles. The footage was astonishing. The pile towered over nearby homes, and residents described the smell as burnt pavement and raw rubber. As journalist Soledad O'Brien walked through the area, she began sneezing almost immediately. I watched the clip and remarked, it took all of 5 seconds for Shingle Mountain to turn Soledad O'Brien into a woman at the beginning of an allergy commercial when she's still in black and white. Blue Star's owner, Chris Ganter, was asked what he would say to the people living near Shingle Mountain. His response was breathtaking in its callousness. The whole neighbourhood around there is gross, he said. It's an industrial area. When asked whether he felt sorry for the residents, he compared living near Shingle Mountain to buying a house next to a nuclear facility and then complaining about it later. Part of me almost appreciated the sheer honesty of his awfulness. No effort to spin or dodge it, I told the audience. Just flat out saying, yeah, it's an icky part of town full of gross pores who deserve to live in filth. But Ganter fundamentally misunderstood the situation. Many residents did not choose to live in an industrial area. Racist zoning policies chose for them. Blue Star eventually went bankrupt, and activists succeeded in getting the Ischls moved. Unfortunately, they were simply relocated across the highway to another landfill permitted by the neighbourhood zoning, which is less a victory and more a municipal version of hiding dirt under a slightly larger rug. History and zoning are only part of the story. Environmental racism also persists because polluters often assume that marginalised communities will lack the political power to resist. A striking example was the Byhalia pipeline in Memphis. The pipeline's proposed route wound through several historically black communities in South Memphis, even though a more direct route existed through wealthier, predominantly white neighbourhoods in the north. I could not help but notice that the affluent suburb was called Germantown. That is the name you give your community, I joked, when Arianville feels a little too obvious. The companies behind the pipeline claimed they had legitimate reasons for choosing the route. But during a community meeting, a company representative reportedly admitted that they had chosen the path of least resistance. There it was. The quiet part said out loud. When people aren't scripted, a local activist observed, you can really learn what they believe. The pipeline company later insisted that the representative's statement did not reflect its official views. They said he should have explained that they sought routes with the least collective impact to the community, which sounds much nicer than we thought these people would have less ability to stop us. Large environmental organisations have not always been reliable allies in these fights. A climate justice activist explained that traditional environmentalism has often focused on saving whales and preserving wilderness while neglecting the communities suffering from pollution. She's right, I said. Environmentalism shouldn't just be about protecting wild spaces. Humans need protection too. And then I made a controversial suggestion. Maybe, I said, conservationists could redirect some of the resources they're wasting on pandas toward environmental justice. I clarified that I meant specifically pandas. We spend so much time saving them, I argued. And why? They don't want to be here. They won't mate. They spend most of their time falling off things. If you watch panda videos, you will discover that pandas are essentially nature's most expensive slapstick comedians. They are constantly tumbling off branches, rolling down hills, and looking mildly surprised by gravity. It's time to let them go, I declared, as fast as they let go of whatever they're holding. The audience laughed, though I suspect several panda enthusiasts were quietly plotting my downfall. But the reality remains stark. Environmental racism is not merely about visible pollution like Shingle Mountain. Sometimes the danger is invisible, buried beneath the ground, carried through the air, or hidden in the water. And far too often, the people responsible for protecting communities fail to warn them until it is far too late. If there was one story that captured the sheer soul-crushing absurdity of environmental racism in America, it was the story of West Calumet Housing Complex in East Chicago. And I say that knowing full well that this country has produced many contenders for the title of most infuriating government failure. West Calumet was a federally assisted housing complex built on top of a former lead smelter, which, on paper, sounds like the setup for a dystopian novel written by someone who hates children. The lead levels there were not merely high. They were catastrophically high. A reporter explained that the safe level of lead in soil is 400 parts per million. At West Calumet, some areas measured 45,000 parts per million, others measured 90,000, 90,000. That is more than 200 times the level requiring cleanup. And where was this lead found? In the ground, a substance that, inconveniently, tends to be everywhere. Unless, of course, You are prepared to spend the rest of your life playing a very high-stakes version of The Floor is Lava. But the most horrifying part was not simply the contamination itself. It was that government agencies had known about the danger for decades and repeatedly failed to tell the residents. In 1985, the Environmental Protection Agency found high levels of lead in the soil near the housing complex. Residents were not notified. In 1998, the Department of Health and Human Services and state health officials discovered that 30% of children under 6 in the complex had elevated blood lead levels. Residents were not notified. In 2009, the EPA declared the land a Superfund site, officially marking it as a priority for contamination cleanup. Residents were still not notified. I paused trying to process this timeline. Federal law, I explained, does not require agencies to tell tenants that their housing is located on a Superfund site, which is a sentence so ridiculous it feels like it should be printed on a novelty T-shirt rather than enshrined in public policy. The entire purpose of a Superfund designation is to identify places that are dangerously contaminated. So declaring an area hazardous and then failing to inform the people living there is like putting a "do not lean over the fence" sign inside a bare enclosure. Technically, the information exists. Practically, it is useless. Finally, in 2016, 31 years after the EPA first identified contamination, the city sent residents a letter informing them of the danger. 31 years, 8 government agencies. And the official response was essentially, by the way, your children may have been playing in poison for their entire lives. Even then, the government's safety recommendations were astonishingly inadequate. Residents were told not to let their children play in the dirt or grass and to remove their shoes before entering their homes. One mother responded with the obvious question, "How do you keep children out of the grass?" That's what children do. She was absolutely right. Kids do not respond well to bureaucratic instructions. You can put up all the signs you want, but children will still see a patch of grass and think, "Excellent, a place to roll around and immediately become covered in mud." I imagined a group of children solemnly reading a government warning sign before deciding to abandon all frolicking, hijinks and tomfoolery. It was absurd. And yet, while West Calumet was an extreme case, it was not an isolated one. 70% of hazardous waste sites on the Superfund list are located within 1 mile of federally assisted housing. 70%. That is not coincidence. That is a system. A system that repeatedly places vulnerable communities in harm's way and then acts surprised when those communities suffer. But environmental racism is not only about cleaning up pollution after the damage is done. It is also about deciding where future pollution will be allowed to occur. And in many parts of America, that decision has effectively created what are known as sacrifice zones, areas where government policy and industry practice concentrate polluters. The logic is brutally simple. If a neighbourhood is already zoned for industry, and if a polluting company is already there, what is one more refinery, one more chemical plant, one more source of toxic air? The answer, of course, is that it is one more burden placed on people who are already carrying too many. One of the most devastating examples is the industrial corridor between New Orleans and Baton Rouge in Louisiana. This area is lined with more than 100 petrochemical plants and refineries. It has earned a name so bleak, so horrifyingly direct, that it sounds like something invented by a satirical novelist who had given up on subtlety. Cancer Alley. Cancer Alley, a real place, a place where people live, a place where the EPA has found cancer risks nearly 50 times the national average in some communities. Residents describe living surrounded by towering industrial facilities. In some towns, even cemeteries are encircled by refineries. I could not help but point out the grim symbolism. Putting an oil refinery around a cemetery, I said, is perhaps the least subtle metaphor for industrial pollution ever constructed. It is difficult to hear the phrase Cancer Alley and not feel a surge of anger. Yet local officials have sometimes attempted to dismiss the term as a myth. One official claimed that Cancer Alley needed to be debunked. He cited tumour registry data as evidence that the area was not truly a cancer hotspot. I stared at the screen. First of all, I said, a tumour registry may be one of the saddest phrases I have ever heard. And this is a show that has discussed baby crib grenades, orthodontic bullying, and elderly people being eaten by alligators. The official's reassurance was not particularly comforting, especially because subsequent research has linked toxic air pollution to higher cancer rates in impoverished Louisiana communities, including his own parish. Residents of Cancer Alley are understandably furious. One retired three-star general asked a devastating question. If ISIS showed up and said they would create jobs, would we let them in? When a retired general compares an industry to ISIS, that is not hyperbole lightly thrown around. That is a man with extensive experience evaluating threats saying, this situation is catastrophically unacceptable, and yet many residents feel trapped. A reporter asked one homeowner why he had not simply moved away. He responded with heartbreaking clarity. Why should I move? How can I move? I struggled all my life to build this. Who would I sell this house to? What poor, unsuspecting family would I trick into moving into this death trap? It was one of the most powerful moments of the evening because the question, why don't you move, is often presented as though relocation is a simple, painless solution. As though people can casually abandon their homes, communities, jobs, schools, churches and entire lives, as though selling a house in a heavily polluted area is as easy as posting a cheerful listing online. I imagine that homeowner creating a real estate advertisement. Charming three-bedroom home in scenic Cancer Alley. Features include a spacious yard, lovely neighbours, and a statistically elevated chance of developing a life-threatening illness. No one should have to make that choice. No one should have to decide between staying in the home they built and exposing their family to toxic pollution. When you step back and look at the full picture, the pattern is undeniable. A history of racist zoning, weak regulation, corporate exploitation and government agencies that too often prioritise industry profits over human health. It is a massive problem. The good news, if one can call it that, is that the federal government has at least begun to acknowledge the issue. President Joe Biden has spoken about the disproportionate impact of climate change and pollution on communities of colour. He has promised to make environmental justice a central part of his administration's agenda. One initiative aims to direct 40% of relevant climate investments to disadvantaged communities. Another promises an annual scorecard measuring progress. These are meaningful commitments. But commitments are not the same as results. As I explained to the audience, the administration had not yet established clear goals for accomplishing these promises. More troublingly, it had stated that race would not be a factor in deciding where to focus efforts. The administration argued that the current Supreme Court would likely strike down explicitly race-based policies. That may be true, but it creates a profoundly frustrating situation. The causes of environmental racism are demonstrably racial, while many proposed solutions must pretend race is irrelevant. It is like treating a broken leg by refusing to acknowledge that the leg exists. So what can be done? First, we must recognise that local activists have been the true heroes of this story. In Memphis, Dallas, Uniontown, Cancer Alley and countless other communities, residents have organised, protested, documented pollution, attended meetings, filed lawsuits and demanded accountability. They have done this work for decades, often with little support from large environmental organisations. They deserve far more resources, attention and partnership. Second, we need significant zoning reform. Polluters and residential communities must be safely separated. The current system, which allows industries to cluster in already vulnerable neighbourhoods, is unacceptable. And finally, we must be willing to call environmental racism by its proper name. When America designates communities of colour as sacrifice zones, it sends a devastating message that some people are worth protecting and others are expendable. That some children deserve clean air and safe playgrounds, while others can be told not to touch the grass. That some families can expect long, healthy lives, while others are forced to accept shortened lifespans as the price of someone else's profit. That is the brutal divide we must confront. Because unless we make serious sustained changes, that divide will remain in place. And with that, after nearly an hour of discussing political stunts, gas station mathematics, toxic waste, and the staggering inequities of environmental pollution, we reach the end of the show. go, I took a breath, looked at the audience and prepared for the final segment. And now this, I announced. The screen filled with clips of television anchors reading, "Rejected personalised licence plates allowed." The Texas Department of Motor Vehicles had denied thousands of licence plate requests, and the rejected entries were a treasure trove of accidental comedy. Fartus, Fat Ace, Fac KU. One driver claimed the Fac KU referred to breeding sheep. Sure it did. Other rejected plates included Old Fart, Hoka and XX. A local news anchor read them with the solemnity of a man delivering wartime dispatches. At one point, another anchor encountered the plate Eat and abruptly stopped. "Well," he said, "I think we've covered them up pretty nicely here." The audience erupted in laughter after everything we had discussed. The corruption, the pollution, the injustice. It was oddly comforting to end on something so gloriously stupid. Because sometimes, after confronting the darkest parts of reality, what you need most is the knowledge that somewhere in America, a person genuinely believed Old Fart would be an appropriate message to display on the back of their car. I smiled at the crowd. "That's our show," I said. "Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next week. Good night." The audience applauded as the lights dimmed, and as I walked off stage, I could not help but think that America remained exactly what it had always been. A place capable of breathtaking injustice, astonishing resilience, and apparently an endless supply of people trying to put profanity on their licence plates.